Hello and welcome to episode 38 of The Racer's Edge in association with F1 Racing Magazine, coming to you on this occasion from my hotel room in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Just arrived in Brazil after a pretty long flight from Austin, Texas, in company with the Renault Sport F1 guys. 30 of them in total, 15 or so went via Washington, as I did, some via Dallas, the rest via Dallas. And, you know, we know and love the Formula One racing mechanics. We know how hard they work. We know their passion. We know their dedication to their chosen profession. We kind of take the engine people for granted. Well, I do anyway. And it was only when I was sitting next to them on a long-haul flight that I really began to realize how tough that season has been for the engineers and mechanics and administrative people as well. And whilst a Formula One mechanic can probably, hopefully look forward to about a 3-week break in December after this Brazilian Grand Prix, guess what? The engine guys are going to have to go straight back to work because 2014 looms, all new regulations, no holidays for any of those engine people. Anyway, we're looking forward, of course, to the Brazilian Grand Prix. But before we do that, let's have a look at all the state of the technical art as we saw it in Austin, Texas. Not very many changes going to be made between those two races. Indeed, not a lot going on because it is right at the end of the year and the championship, so far as many teams are concerned, is done and dusted. Nonetheless, I spoke to Craig Scarborough, our resident technical expert, after Saturday qualifying in Austin. We spoke about, of course, the new refreshing speed of Williams. Great new trademark stamp there, really, from Pat Simmons, ever the practical engineer. So we talk about that. And beyond that, of course, we continue to look forward to 2014 and what we can expect. And as time goes on, we're learning more and more about that. So this is Craig Scarborough as we spoke after qualifying in Austin, Texas. Craig, looking back, first of all, to Austin, I guess we're at that point of the year where we're going to be really struggling to see any real technical developments on the cars. But the big story was the performance of the Williams and the new exhaust layout there that we first saw in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, I mean, this was something of a surprise. Abu Dhabi, they turned up with some development parts. We initially understood that these were parts that were for 2014 to take away the exhaust effect from the diffuser. But they brought 2 sets of these parts, they worked, and they stayed on the car for the weekend, and lo and behold, they're still on the car 2 weeks later here in Austin. So it's somewhat surprising that Williams have found so much pace from taking away something that should be something that gives them a lot of performance.
I was talking to Pastor Maldonado actually before Abu Dhabi, and he said, it was about 3 weeks before, and he said, wait till we get to Abu Dhabi, there's going to be something on the car there that will change the performance radically. And he was right.
Yeah.
So I guess the first question is, let's look in detail at what they've done, and if we can just describe that. And you've done some very nice drawings for us of how they've gone about making this change.
Well, if we look back at how the car has been for this season, they've had very much what we describe as the McLaren-style Coanda exhaust, where you have this bulge in the side pod, as you can see, and the exhaust comes out of the this bulge through a channel which has this Coanda effect and bends the airflow or the exhaust flow down towards the diffuser, and this helps seal the diffuser, particularly when you run very large rear ride heights, which gives you much more rear downforce. And you know, teams will tell you about it's worth about 1.5 seconds per lap, it's worth 60 points of downforce or something around these areas. It's a very powerful effect. But what Williams have done is take that effect away. So very much like we saw last year, where teams were having the exhaust pointing up and then just flowing along the back of the bodywork. So when we look at the current car, as we've seen in the past 2 races, the exhaust are pointing up, there's no channel, there's no Coanda effect, the heat from the exhaust and the exhaust plume is just trailing along the back of the side pods, effectively doing very little for the aero. It will always have an aero impact, but it's nothing along the scale of blowing the diffuser. So they've taken this effect completely away from the car, and it's given them loads of other benefits apart from the fact that it's lost them downforce in the process.
It's a bit like the old days where in order to go quicker you went to smaller turbos because you actually had better throttle response and the car was more drivable. And what Bottas and Maldonado were saying in Austin particularly was that in throttle off conditions now the back end is much more stable, and that gives A, the drivers confidence, B, it gives them effectively more speed into the corner, even though, as you say, they've lost downforce. But in reality, they're going to be braking later, they're going to be using the brakes better, and all those things add up to a much more drivable car.
Very much. I mean, it's taken away the peakiness in the car's performance. So the car will have much less downforce. That's obvious. But as you said, as they're coming off of the throttle, going into the corner at mid-corner, they're not suffering this big change in downforce. And drivers don't like that effect. It makes them feel very nervous. They're never quite sure how predictable the car will be. So you're getting a much more consistent level of performance. One of the other big changes is because they're no longer trying to constrict the exhaust into a very difficult shape and blowing it in a particular area, you're actually freeing up quite a lot of horsepower from the engine. So they're actually getting a power boost as well as, you know, this consistency for the driving. And it's strange that Williams over probably the past 2 or 3 years, where blowing the diffuser has been obviously the key aerodynamic development, Williams had never got on top of this. And yeah, it's strange now that they've decided to take it away, and I was reaping the benefits. And I'm sure there's a couple of other teams maybe a bit further down the grid that are now thinking, have we got time to try this? But it's probably all too late now in this season.
And of course, the question being put to the drivers, unfairly to the drivers, but obviously effectively to the team, is, well, why didn't you try this sooner? And have you left it too late? And of course, the reality is, well, you know, hindsight's brilliant, and we could have tried it sooner, but we learned a lot along the way, and at least we found it in time for 2014.
Well, this goes back to some of the fundamental problems we have when we're talking about car development. The wind tunnel in CFD will tell the engineers this part or this solution will give this amount of performance. And you have to trust those figures, but the reality on track, what we always talk about, correlation, doesn't happen. And it's very hard to say, well, let's just turn these things off. Last year, Williams had problems with their front wing, and when they put an old wing on during a test, there was another one of these light bulb moments. Hold on, the old wing was so much better than the new one, but the new one has given us all of these figures from the testing in the wind tunnel and in CFD that means it should be better. And with the lack of testing that the teams get nowadays, with Friday practice and the occasional straight line, they don't get the chance to do all of these back-to-back or these ABA tests, as the teams call them, where they'll put something on, change it for something else, and then change it back again just to see how it feels. You just don't have this time and this luxury.
You make a very good point there, Scarbs, because we don't have testing in order to save money. But in reality, if you look at Williams' specific season, it's actually cost them a fortune not to be testing because they've had a poor year. And as you correctly say, if they'd done 3 days of back-to-backing in Barcelona, they would have had a better year. More money would have come into the team as a result, probably, and testing would have justified its existence. So it's an interesting way of looking at the cost saving of Formula One and look at the penalty that the team has paid. I suppose the argument is, well, other teams didn't make the same mistake, so Williams shouldn't have gone down that path. But nonetheless, difficult to beat testing as something that's a practical solution. It's an empirical solution to what is an empirical problem for virtually all Formula One teams as we speak. We talk about CAD, but nonetheless, it is a lot of trial and error out there. Scarbs, you mentioned the power increase potentially from the engine. Chatting to Rob White at Austin, he had some interesting things to say about the air leaks that Romain Grosjean suffered, first of all in Singapore, where it caused the retirement, but then later on in India, where they managed it. And they managed it because they knew what the problem was. And he, the way he spoke about it, it was an internal problem, but not within the internal circumference of the engine that you're not allowed to, that is sealed. So they are able to look at identical parts and make sure the problem doesn't happen again. But it's to do with the interface between two materials, he said. And it just shows, even though we take for granted now the reliability of these engines and the performance of the Renaults and the others, but particularly the Renaults, the success they've had this year, how fine the margins still are inside the workings of the engines, because there was nothing actually fundamentally wrong with the Grosjean engine. It was just on the edge of that compatibility between materials, and that was an eye-opening conversation for me, because it was just reminded us of how fine these tolerances are.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've taken reliability for granted for many years now, since the engine specification freeze. The teams can't throw loads of new parts and developments at the engines. They can't keep just finding ways to make more power. All they're going to do is refine what they've got. And occasionally, small things do go wrong. And, how many times over the years have we seen a car fail a race because of, a 5-penny washer or a seal that goes? And it's very similar, as you explained there, with the pneumatic valve return system on the cars. But they've got it wrapped, and looking forward to next year. I think we'll be enjoying a lot more unreliability from the engines. There'll be a lot more to ponder.
Yeah,
on
well, they were. And actually, on the Renault case, there's also Mark Webber's had some problems as well recently. He lost the water from the engine in Singapore. And I assumed that was some sort of radiator damage, debris.
I think it was.
Rob said probably not. It looks like it was a sort of, we don't know why it did actually lose water. It was radiator related, but they can't say for sure it was debris. So that's another thing, it happened. And then beyond that, he had the alternator problem.
Yes.
And that was a loom chafing issue. So it's not to do with, well, I guess you could argue it's the way the Red Bull is put together, and we all know how the packaging is on that car, but equally it was something that's never occurred before, and it wasn't as a result of any incident. It was just a loom that chafed. Again, one of these things.
But we've obviously seen that the Red Bull alternator has been an issue, and a lot of people were pointing their fingers at the packaging, but it was the first I've heard that it was a loom problem. It wasn't the alternator, because they've changed alternator manufacturers this year from the Morelli to the McLaren Electronic Systems alternator. So it's good to see that that's been cleared out. But as you say, it's every element of these cars is designed, literally every cable run, every point where every cable meets the chassis and is zip tied on is all designed in CAD. But stuff can still happen. I think in some respects it's nice to know that odd things can happen occasionally.
They're human.
Yes, not everything can be accounted for.
And talking about that again, Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton's Abu Dhabi suspension failure in qualifying, which was a bizarre thing in the context of the reliability of a 2013 Formula One car, particularly by the time it gets to qualifying. We've seen things happen in prior to qualifying, but in qualifying. And that turns out to have been a wishbone mounting point or bracket, which, so I hear, was related to a new rear geometry they were running, which they ran in Suzuka for the first time, and there was some incident with a tyre problem that Lewis incurred in Japan, and that part was on the car in Abu Dhabi, having gone back and been properly checked, obviously, but that was the cause of that failure in Abu Dhabi. So it's interesting with the passage of time to see actually, because we write these things off, rear suspension failure, but why? This is Mercedes, this is Abu Dhabi, this is qualifying. So again, an interesting little story behind that, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't get many failures. A Formula One car around a circuit, despite all of the curbs and all of the off-track moments that the drivers have, the teams understand the loads passing through the suspension down to the nth degree, which is why we don't get the failures and why these things are able to be designed to be quite so slim and so minuscule. But as you say, they take these parts back, the wishbones, they do lots of testing back at the factory. And they will x-ray them and they will put stresses on them and they'll listen with a little microphone to hear if you can hear the carbon fibre cracking inside the structure. Obviously it's passed all of these tests, but that little tiny fault in there somewhere eventually will lead to a failure. And again, they've done so much work, it's a shame that you would lose a result like that.
And it was interesting looking at the job list on the Sunday morning of all the bits they changed from Abu Dhabi on that Lewis thing. The whole rear suspension, basically, both sides. Just
pretty much it comes as a pre-assembled unit and they just unbolt it at the gearbox.
But everything had to be itemised with the FIA, of course.
Exactly, yeah.
I was in the end of the conversation with Rob White, and I know this was specifically, I had you in mind when I asked about this. I said, what are you going to do with all these 2013 engines, Rob? Can we have some, please? Can we have some blocks and some heads, please? Thank you very much. And he sort of laughed and said, he was very polite about it, but he said there was a totem pole of people that were well above us in the list there. Not the least of which was, he said, there are going to be, for the next 3 years, interestingly, he thinks there'll be quite a lot of running show cars from the F1 teams with these current engines in them. So they're kind of building up for that. And I suppose we haven't really thought about that very much, have we? But with the new engine regulations coming into play in 14, throughout 14, when the teams do promotional work, it's going to be the current cars we see.
Yeah, they'll probably dress them up to make them look like the 2014 cars, but it will be the mechanical package of the current cars. Red Bull, interestingly, have only recently, in the past, I think about a year, gone away from their old Cosworth-engined, Toro Rosso-based show car and put in a Renault engine. I think it's an RB6 that they run now. But as you say, there's managing these cars is a big part of what teams do, because they do a lot of tests.
And then they put a lot of other engines into a special archive area ready for all the private customers who are going to be buying these cars and running them and then they're going to be good runners. And Rob made the point that because of the reliability of these engines now, they are probably going to be the best Formula One cars ever to buy as a private collector who wants to have fun with them, or even race them in historic events, because they are going to run with an oil change and that's about it really, because they are so rock solid.
Yeah, absolutely. And if they're not buzzing them up to the maximum revs, I think the lifetime of the engine probably would be, potentially a season long, which for any form of top-level motorsport is pretty incredible.
2014, we've talked about that a lot. You're in the news. You've caused a stir on the autosport.com website with some superb drawings, your interpretation of how the 2014 cars are going to look. Let's have a look at these and see what's been causing all the stirring and interest.
Well, as you can see from the picture there, the first look at an aggressively designed 2014 nose is a bit shocking. The rule changes next year are aimed at bringing the nose tip down to a much lower height, and this is all aimed at so that nose to rear tyre contact doesn't flip the car, and also potentially on a T-bone accident that the nose is well away from the driver area. So they've mandated the tip of the nose must be just 18.5 centimetres above the ground, or above the base of the car, whereas at the moment they're probably about 55 centimetres, maybe a little bit less than that. But what teams don't want is to have a bulky crash structure forming the nose actually low down, because that starves the underbody of air. So what they want to try and do is raise as much of the nose up as way as possible, but still meet the regulation that says a 10 centimetre square or a 10 centimetre area on the front of the nose must be at this height. So all teams are doing is creating a little regulatory beak. There's some other words people describe these as, and we're not going to use those on air. But this section there is purely to meet the regulations and will form the first part of the crash structure. But as you see, the larger wedge-shaped nose, a much wider section above, is the primary crash structure. Teams are going to have lots of different ways of tackling this next year, but it's going to be very much teams are going to want to have a very slim, very low nose with most of the structure high up and further behind it. And we'll get used to the look, but they do look a bit shocking at first glimpse. And your drawing, Scarbs, is based on your interpretation, or is it in consultation with the teams, and they're thinking in this way? It is based on some facts. I know that this design has been tested by teams. Obviously, they're going to go through lots of iterations of noses, and some technical directors say that they may well test different noses at different points during the winter testing. But yeah, very much this design has been built in carbon fibre for at least one team, and obviously the more you publicise this, other people go, we've got a nose just like that as well. Not quite like that, but very similar. So I think the concept will remain the same, but maybe the execution and the detail, and maybe trying to make it a little bit aesthetically more pleasing.
Well, that was going to be my next point. Given the history of the step nose and how they've tried to make that more aesthetically pleasing, as you say, what do you think will happen now? Do you think there'll be more revisions of the regulations even before we get into 14, because this is now out and there's going to be an outcry?
As I understand, no, there won't be. There'll be no changes to this regulation or any clarifications. There's been a couple of clarifications from Charlie Whiting already around how you use this minimum surface area for the tip. And one team put an idea forwards, I think being speculative, to say make sure this gets banned so that no one else tries this. But to change that now is a big problem, because this has such a fundamental impact on the airflow further back down the car, particularly underneath the car, that if you suddenly said, let's make this nose tip twice as wide, which is arguably it probably needs to be within the regulations, the teams would be going back to the wind tunnel and have to design a big chunk of the aerodynamics. Whereas with a stepped nose, it was a much more benign area of the car that they could just put these covers on with very little impact further down. And as we've seen, some teams have not bothered to fit them. Caterham, for example, fitted one and they've decided to take it off because it makes such little difference. But the 2014 nose tip is much more fundamental and part of the airflow structure of the car. So if anything's going to change, it wouldn't be in this for the next year.
Well, the flow word, very much the word of Austin as well, I think, from the engine point of view. A lot of the engine technical directors talking about the fuel flow meters that will be coming into play, which is the mandatory FIA fuel flow meter. And at the moment, as we think about them, pity the poor companies that will be given this homologation job, but the tolerances within the manufacturing process are sufficiently big, if that's the right word, or large, to be worrisome, because apparently 1% difference between one meter and another equals 1 horsepower. Which could be significant, and at the moment there is quite a lot of talk about that and how that is going to be monitored. But having said that, I understand that each manufacturer will have its own code within the McLaren ECU, which also monitors fuel flow. So there'll be a double effect, if you like, in terms of monitoring the fuel flow. But that code will be unique to the manufacturer, not to the FIA or to the ECU. So there's quite a lot, I think, to be talked about there in the next couple of months, and quite a lot of meetings will be taking place about that. Yeah,
I mean, I think the whole phase that all of the engine manufacturers are in now, along with all of the the suppliers into them, have got lots of little problems to solve, and this is one of the fairly key ones, because we're talking at the end of the day about legality, and a car could stop short, or it might not have enough power.
And it's up to the team to ensure that the engine conforms with the regulations, of course.
Yes.
And if that part is spurious, it's nonetheless up to the team to make sure that the engine still conforms.
Yeah, and I'm sure that if they've got one sensor that's going to give them the 1% over rather than the 1% under, they'll have a shelf full of those ready to go. So
it's a question of the tolerances they're going to allow, of course, isn't it? And how big those tolerances are, whether it's 0.1 or whether it's 0.5.
Yeah,
well, I mean, take an extreme example.
As the regulations are worded, it's 100 kilograms an hour and 100 kilograms of fuel for the race, no tolerance. So it's one of these things that will evolve, and I don't imagine the FIA are going to take a particularly hard line initially, but I think it's one of these problems that needs to be solved. And particularly before a big rule change, there's normally a situation where lots of people sound very nervous about a very big issue, and when we come down to it, everyone has worked out the issues and come to some sensible conclusions, and we never hear about these things again. So I don't think we should be too concerned.
Well, they were the buzzwords, but as ever, Scarbs, any before we close, any other thoughts on the existing 2013 cars and any development that we're going to see before Brazil, that you think?
I don't think we're going to see much at Brazil. I've been told that Red Bull are still actively developing the car, because they're going for this, record nine victories. And they're pushing very hard for that. A couple of little tiny details on the car this weekend. Ferrari equally are pushing very hard. I think now that Raikkonen isn't in the championship challenge, I think Ferrari may have backed off a bit. But again, a couple of little tweaks on the Ferrari show that they're still working quite hard. The rest of the teams pretty much now have left the car unchanged for several races now. And I think Brazil will just be a final chance to get these loud V8s racing around, get them finished up and packed away.
Last time, just on Ferrari, I did actually ask James Allison in Austin, or I asked Fernando actually, whether there were any James Allison in inverted commas parts on the car yet, knowing that James will have had time now to look at this car and will be thinking, don't like this, don't like that, or do like this, do like that. And he was emphatic, saying, no, there is nothing James Allison at all on this car in terms of development. We're seeing little bits still on the front wing and stuff like that, but that's part of their ongoing
That's just
program.
Part of the normal development. I think where Ferrari are going to benefit from having somewhat James Allison isn't so much in actually designing the shapes of parts, but the process by which the team go about deciding which bits get looked at, what the targets are, and how you subsequently test that. So we get back to this correlation question. Is the figures that the wind tunnel and the CFD are promising delivered out on track? And obviously that's one of the problems Ferrari have really had this year, where the developments just haven't delivered the upgrade to the car that's been required.
Yeah, the correlation, a key issue. But we should never forget, however, that James is one of the most creative guys out there, as we saw from the forward-facing exhausts and, on the Lotus F1 that he did. And it wasn't bad, actually, but then very quickly he went back to the double diffuser that everybody else was running and made that work too. So he is a creative guy, and it'll be really interesting, I think, to see what he comes up with at Ferrari next year. Scarbs, as ever, great pleasure talking to you, getting your insight, and well done again on those drawings and the stir that's caused, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.